Johannesburg, metropolis of South Africa, one of the great cities of the Commonwealth. Johannesburg is planning for for it is young, confident, vigorous, and rich. For under its very streets, a mile below, are the tunnels of vast gold. There are more Europeans here than anywhere else in Africa, and it is they who have built Johannesburg, but not without African labor. By law, Africans are to live in separate areas. This is Apartheid Separation, South Africa's answer to the meeting of civilization and black Africa, the concept of the Nationalist Party of Prime Minister Johannesburg. But many do not believe in apartheid, and this is South Africa's greatest political issue. There are 14 million people in the Union of South Africa, and for each one who is white, there are 4 who are not. With few exceptions, only the white minority is allowed to vote. It has elected a government which is very concerned with differences in skin pigmentation. But this government believes it has a solution for the race problem. And some of its leaders explained it to me very earnestly when I visited South Africa not long ago. In this program, we're going to examine that solution. We've already seen that there's a good deal of racial and economic discontent in some of the colonies and protectorates. So let's look at the only Commonwealth country that has both full self-government and an acute racial problem. To understand South Africa, it helps to know something of its history. So we'll first see some scenes from that by the present-day descendants of the original white settlers. When the first Dutchmen landed at the Cape of Good Hope, they found no one there except some dark-skinned nomads. They were friendly, so the Dutch were able to build in peace, and they bartered for livestock with these nomads called Hottentots. The vines and vegetables planted by the Dutch prospered in the African soil, and the colony grew. More settlers came from the Netherlands, and there were immigrants from Germany and France too. A comfortable and privileged way of life was developing. The native blacks proved very handy for the country's economic development, for these men did not have to be paid. They were slaves. 300 years ago, slavery was taken for granted. Napoleon Bonaparte indirectly changed the destiny of South Africa. He was at war with the British, and the British were determined that the strategic Cape of Good Hope should be kept out of his hands. So they took it, and it became a British colony. Soon, immigrants started arriving from England. The descendants of the original settlers, who had come to be called Afrikaners or Boers, were not unfriendly at first toward the British immigrants. They were much more worried about some other neighbors, the Bantu. The Bantu had been slowly moving southwards as the Afrikaners moved north. Both were in search of new lands, and there had been sporadic clashes for many years. The tough Afrikaner farmers fought bravely, and they were often bitter about the lack of British support. In 1834, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire, and the Afrikaners were forced to free their slaves. Angered by this and other British policies, they decided to move north and set up republics where they hoped to preserve their old way of life. So the Great Trek began. But Dingaan stood in the way. Dingaan, ruthless king of the Zulus, didn't want the settlers to have this area. He had proved himself in wars against many tribes, and now he was ready to take on the white man. He did so at Blood River on December 16, 1838. The fate of the Great Trek was at stake. And so Dingaan was defeated and the Afrikaners moved on. In the old colony, Britain had given non-whites almost all legal rights. But in the new Afrikaner republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, black labor would be cheaper, for there British laws would not apply. In 1867, diamonds were discovered in South Africa. And 19 years later, gold was found too. Remote Afrikaner areas became fabulously valuable. Meanwhile, Cecil Rhodes arrived on the scene with a burning ambition to unite South Africa. Paul Kruger, president of the South African Republic, suspected that Britain would try to do it by force. The British felt the Republic was depriving British settlers of their rights, and these controversies led to the Boer War. The Afrikaner farmers fought skillfully, and the British had to field 7 soldiers for every one of them. Under these great odds, the Afrikaners were defeated by 1902, and they went home to farms that had been ruthlessly destroyed. Besides finding their homes gone, they learned that 20,000 of their women and children had died of disease and neglect in concentration camps operated by the British. The Boer War left a legacy of bitterness. But Britain followed a policy of reconciliation, and within 4 years, the former Afrikaner republics had been granted self-government. And then, in 1910, they became part of the Union of South Africa, a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. When elections were held, Louis Botha became first Prime Minister of the Union. His principal lieutenant was Jan Christian Smuts, and both these Afrikaners were friendly to Britain. Theirs was the political sentiment that brought South Africa to Britain's side in the 2 world wars, although in both cases, many of their countrymen were indifferent to the British cause. Smuts in particular was a friend of Britain. He was a great traveler and a familiar figure in many Commonwealth capitals, for the Commonwealth idea had few supporters more enthusiastic. A very different political conviction was represented by Dr. Daniel F. Malan, whose Nationalist Party looked forward to eventual severance of ties with Britain and the establishment of a republic. In 1948, he was elected to power, and for the first time in the country's history, there were only Afrikaners in the cabinet. These were the architects of apartheid, of the strictest racial segregation, and theirs was the nationalism epitomized by a massive monument not far from where they sat. The Voortrekker Monument in Pretoria is the shrine and the rallying point of Afrikaner nationalism, for it symbolizes the determination of ancestors who made the Great Trek and suffered great hardships to preserve their way of life. In daily life and in ceremonial, the nationalists consistently endeavor to maintain these traditions. A pleasant occasion, But whatever the music and whatever the memories, there's one reality that's seldom far from their minds. Until the 1920s, most non-whites either lived on their own reserves and cultivated their own land, or worked on the land of the white farmers. Among these farmers, there was a widespread feeling that this, by rights, was their own land, and the non-whites were foreigners who belonged in their traditional villages. But South Africa was moving in new directions, and mining was becoming the most important industry. From the Bantu villages, the mines drew on a vast reservoir of cheap labor. These miners were housed in compounds owned by the mines and had little contact with the white population. After working hours, their employers encouraged them in tribal activities. And so they would work and live for several months. Then they would return to their villages, live there for a while, and then perhaps go back to the mines. But meanwhile, the cities of South Africa were growing quickly. And here too there was a need for men to do the unskilled, heavy physical labor. But here there were no compounds. So many Bantu brought their families to the cities and lived in squatters' camps or areas allocated to them by the whites. Ordinary white people seldom venture into these locations, but they all know about them. Some Afrikaner clergymen and intellectuals and others are sincerely concerned and would like to help the Bantu. But these people are generally unwilling to consider racial partnership as it's being developed in other parts of the Commonwealth. They feel South Africa's path must be different. They say that white men are sometimes tempted to exploit the weaker black man. And to prevent this, they suggest completely separate living areas, with the Bantu kept at a distance. The Bantu would be much happier in their villages, these people often claim. Those who have not left for the cities should be encouraged to stay where they are, and perhaps those in the cities should return to the villages. But because the Bantu farming methods are wasteful and inefficient, the whites will show them how to become good, prosperous farmers. If the Bantu would learn modern agriculture and how to use other natural resources, say the theoreticians, they would be able to support themselves in their own tribal areas. Thus, they could live apart from the whites, and there would be no interracial mingling or friction. But unfortunately in South Africa, there are large arid wastes, and it's doubtful if more than a third of the land could ever be cultivated. There's drought and flood, and it often takes special methods and equipment to farm successfully. But even if the Bantu could afford tractors, there is still the problem of land. The area, for more than 8 million Bantu, constitutes about 1/8 of the land. For less than 3 million whites, there is all the rest. So the Bantu, without enough soil of his own, often ends up working for the white farmer. Again, apartheid results in cheap labor. White man and black are together at work, but very much apart when it comes to enjoying the fruits of their efforts. A few years ago, the government set up the Tomlinson Commission to find out how the reserves could be improved. After much study, the Commission issued a report that was startling. Less than 45 years from now, it said, the whites would be outnumbered 6-1. There would be over 20 million Bantu, and unless the reserves were tremendously developed, 17 million would have to live in white areas. This development of the reserves, said the report, would have to be industrial as well as rural, and would take about $300 million in the next 10 years. And even then, the reserves would only reach a point where they could accommodate half the Bantu. The government has, in effect, ignored the more unpleasant aspects of the Tomlinson report, which proved that even partial apartheid would involve tremendous financial sacrifices on the part of the whites. Even if partial apartheid could work, it would be a severe blow to the nation's industry, which relies heavily on African labor. So the Bantu seem to have come to the cities to stay, to live where they can on meager wages. In most locations, it is against the law for Africans to own land. The purposes of apartheid are best served if the black man has no roots in the cities. Those who realize that rural apartheid can't work say that apartheid must be made to work in the cities. The Bantu would still be strictly segregated, but an effort would be made to provide better homes that they could rent or even own. Some progress has been made in this direction, but less than 5% have benefited so far. Similarly, there would be better schools to widen opportunities for Bantu, but strictly within their own society. Thus, in 1953, the government took over complete control of Bantu education, so it alone could decide how much or how little could be taught. A Bantu who enters a profession must do so with the aim of serving his own people. Supporters of apartheid point to the fact that the Bantu are being taught trades. But a close look shows that it is chiefly elementary skills that are taught. As for higher education, apartheid is now being stepped up in the universities. In 1955, out of a population of 8 million Bantu, only 400 were receiving higher education. The Bantu still feel a lack of educated men who could become their leaders. Theirs is to be a very restricted area within an economy that is booming. Supporters of apartheid often use the phrase separate but parallel, meaning two different societies, each developing along its own lines and with unlimited opportunities within the framework of each. But the highly developed, highly industrialized society of South Africa cannot be separated in this way. The Bantu will continue to work in the white economy and at the same time be denied full rights in the white society in the name of illusory separate opportunities. To many Bantu leaders, the whole idea seems a complete fraud. In the white sector of the economy, the Bantu does most of the hard physical labor. Yet in the very buildings and railways he has helped to build, he is constantly faced by the affront of segregation. Now, these advocates of apartheid are not cruel and heartless men. Most of them are honest, decent, God-fearing. And it's interesting to note that their racial approach has the support of the largest religious group in the country, the Dutch Reformed churches. Another factor is the overwhelming fear felt by many whites, almost an obsession, that if racial discrimination were relaxed, a large-scale intermarriage would inevitably result, and the whites would be absorbed in an inferior mixed race. There's another motive, too. Many of the supporters of apartheid are white people at relatively low income levels. They have a hard enough time getting along as it is. The prospect of further competition in their trades, in the form of skilled Bantu workers, rouses their opposition. So they encourage apartheid to see that the Bantus are kept at a low, unskilled economic level and out of the white economy, except at these very lowest levels. Along with these fears, there's a considerable measure of ignorance about much that is going on in the rest of the world. We mustn't forget that many of these people's forebears isolated themselves in the Great Trek a century ago, and their descendants have kept themselves isolated from the main currents of Western science and thought. These, then, are some of the minority attitudes that guide the destiny of over 10 million non-whites who are becoming increasingly bitter. The intensified segregation that the Milan government started developing in 1948 drew strong protests from the African National Congress, which was founded almost 50 years ago. Members of the Congress could protest and denounce and even hope, but they could not vote. Torch Commando was a white protest group. In contrast to some of Milan's cabinet ministers, who were open admirers of Nazism, these men had fought it during the war and were angered by what they considered authoritarian, Nazi-like methods in South Africa. The country was bitterly divided. Some said that this disunity was deliberately fostered by the government as its policies flourished in an atmosphere of hatred and distrust. The government argued that it alone could prevent racial contamination. These were the passionate issues as the 1953 elections approached. The Nationalists were re-elected, and the following year, when Dr. Milan retired, Mr. Stratham became Prime Minister. Mr. Stratham's goal was more and stricter apartheid. A few months after Mr. Stratham came to power, the residents of Sophia Town were required to move from their homes. Some families had lived there for decades and owned their own homes. But the land was needed for the expanding white community. So they were forcibly removed to another area where the housing would be better, but where the Bantu would not be allowed to own land. To many people, it seems that apartheid is gradually turning South Africa into a police state in which many complex racial laws are enforced. Here, all non-whites must carry passes so that their movements may be controlled. In a year, there may be over 250,000 arrests for infractions of the pass laws. By the government buildings, women were assembled in silent protest. They claimed that the methods used by the government to push through its measures had killed the Constitution. They were wearing black sashes to mourn its passing. Toward the end of 1956, 153 leading South Africans were arrested. Among them were clergymen, writers, teachers, intellectuals. Among other measures, the government had passed a law clearly stating that it was an offense punishable by flogging to protest against legislation. With the mass trials that followed, South Africa entered a new era in its history. Apartheid can be challenged on many grounds. It's possible to quote the Bible and say that all men were created in the image of God, regardless of color. It's possible to quote many liberal philosophers who agree that all men were created equal. But even if one disagrees with these ideas, which are pretty fundamental in Western thought, there are still immediate practical implications about apartheid that affect all of us. I came back from my recent visit to South Africa deeply perturbed about the outlook. It seemed to me that the policy of apartheid ran counter to the basic factors that are so important for the development of South Africa and for the survival of the free world. Internally, it threatens a serious dislocation of an expanding economy that can't do without native labor any more than it can dispense with white capital and techniques. Its external implications are even more important for the rest of us. The fundamental issue in the world today is the threat of totalitarian communism to the freedom of the whole world. If free nations are to meet this, they must all stick together. That's an urgent issue that cuts clear across all questions of race or creed. If the nations who believe in freedom are to unite to defend freedom, then it must be on a basis of equality, no matter what their color or race. Now, nowhere has that been more applied, more fundamentally applied, than in the post-war Commonwealth, with its broadening multiracial basis. In this unique grouping, there's equal room for Canada and Ceylon, New Zealand and Ghana. The problems of South Africa are very real, and they're appallingly complex, and there's no easy answer. But it's more than doubtful whether a policy of discrimination provides a solution for South Africa, and it's certainly impossible as a basis for the development of the Commonwealth, or even for its survival. As we've seen, there are similar problems in the colonies, but the answers aren't all the same. In our two remaining programs, we'll return to the colonies and see what alternatives there are. Until then, this is Edgar McInnes of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs.